Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 20th of February, 2025, Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The President reported that the Out of London Exeter meeting was unfortunately cancelled due to speaker illness. Therefore, no minutes were taken at the ordinary meeting of Thursday, the 13th of February, 2025, to be read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Fueling the Anthropocene, Technology, Networks and Environmental Impact of the Bronze Age Step Metallurgy by Dr. Miliana Radovic, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would happen on Thursday, the 27th of February. He then adjourned the meeting and a reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear our lecture. Our two lecturers this evening, Dr. Rebecca Welshman and Dr. Simon Coleman, welcome to you. Rebecca is an honorary research fellow at the University of Liverpool. She works on projects concerning the literary archaeology of place, study of texts in the context of geography, history, and environment. She did a PhD at the University of Exeter and has presented a series of papers at a variety of conferences across the UK and Europe. She is published in historical, cultural, and literary studies. Her latest essay highlights the military association of the works of Shakespeare and appears in Reading the River in Shakespeare's Britain from Edinburgh University Press last year. Simon Coleman did a degree in ancient history and then qualified as an archivist. He's worked in a variety of academic institutions, including the BL, the universities of Bath and Sussex, and he's now based at West Dean College in West Sussex. His work is focused on archives from the 19th and 20th centuries, covering subjects such as literature, art, and political history. He's written widely. Since moving to Sussex 10 years ago, he started to explore the question of the site of the Battle of Hastings, looking at issues around interpretation of sources, landscape change, and the official narratives, hence the current debate. Our speakers this evening are going to present a paper, Heathfield Down 1066, why this could be the actual site of the Battle of Hastings. Welcome to you both.
Okay, am I ready to start? Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to this lecture. And welcome to everyone joining online as well. Firstly, we'd like to extend our thanks to the Society of Antiquaries for hosting us. Tonight, we're going to share with you a new body of research that identifies an alternative location for the battlefield of Hastings, 1066, one of the most decisive battles in British and European history. For 5 years, we've been researching the theory that the battle may have taken place near Heathfield in East Sussex, 10 miles northwest of the town of Battle and its abbey, on land once known as Heathfield Down. There's a map of the area of East Sussex, and you see the red arrows, you see the town of Battle there, and our proposed site is up there, close to Heathfield. Of course, down on the east coast, you have Hastings, and then further to the west, there's Pevensey And of course, the Pevensey Levels was a vast inland bay where the Normans almost certainly landed. Last year, we published an article on the subject in the peer-reviewed International Journal of Military History and Historiography. And tonight's presentation is part of a series of talks to historical and archaeological societies, which we began last summer. Now, Battle Abbey has been established as the official battlefield from a long tradition that the abbey was built on the battlefield by order of William I. This tradition first appeared in a written source over 30 years after the battle and was subsequently repeated in medieval chronicles. Now, we must very briefly recall the events which immediately preceded the battle. King Harold II, the last Anglo-Saxon king, defeated the Norwegian Viking army of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire on the 25th of September, 1066. 2 days later, Duke William's Norman army landed in Pevensey Bay between Eastbourne and Hastings, forcing Harold to march south to defend his kingdom a second time. After spending a few days in London, he led his army into East Sussex, where he encountered the Normans on the 14th of October. The sources tell us that Harold took up a defensive position on higher ground, and after a battle that lasted nearly all day, his English army was eventually overwhelmed, with his death bringing the Anglo-Saxon era to a sudden and climactic end. Innumerable history books in the last 200 years or so have asserted, without any doubt, that Battle Abbey is the site of the battle, on the strength of its foundation tradition. Yet, despite several excavations, no verifiable physical evidence for a battle there has so far been found. In recent years, 4 books have been published arguing for alternative sites within a 3-mile radius of Battle Abbey. And in 2013, a Channel 4 Time Team program investigated the question of the battlefield's location. Time Team conducted a LiDAR survey around the town of Battle, which found a large area of marsh covering the grounds between the assumed positions of the 2 armies. And this is Time Team's LiDAR slide. The survey found that the ground below the assumed English position, and that's the small red area in the center, the red areas are higher ground. The ground below the English position was so marshy that troops, especially cavalry, would have found great difficulty in operating there. Now, the marshy ground is represented by a vast blue area, and Time Team concluded that that would have made a battle very impossible. So the official battlefield, they more or less ruled out, and they started looking at another site just about here to the east of the Abbey. The Abbey stands there. This area is little more than the width of a mini roundabout there, and we can't see how approximately 16,000 troops could have operated there and drawn up battle lines. So we cannot devote any further time to addressing the issues surrounding Battle Abbey, but we will be happy to discuss these during the questions session. Only one of the early sources for the battle gives the battlefield a name, and that is the version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle known as the Worcester Chronicle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles are a collection of historical accounts by year known as annals, written by scribes in various English monasteries between the 9th century and the mid-12th century. The 2 texts that record the events of 1066 are the aforementioned Worcester Chronicle, called the D version, and the Peterborough Chronicle, known as the E version. The relevant passage about the battle in the D version was written only a few years after 1066. And I'll quote from that. Harold came against William at the Hoar Apple Tree, literally the grey apple tree, and William came upon him by surprise before his people were marshalled. We've always felt that this brief statement contains 2 important clues: the name of the battlefield Hoar Apple Tree, and the suggestion that William achieved some sort of surprise against Harold. We'll be returning to this quotation at different stages of the talk, and as it's so important to our theory, we thought we'd bring it up early in the lecture. From Victorian times, this grey apple tree, which was on or close to the battlefield, has commonly been known as the Hoar Apple Tree. The other 11th century sources are nearly all by Norman or French writers, principally William of Poitiers, William of Jumièges, and the poem called The Song of the Battle of Hastings. And of course, there's the Bayeux Tapestry as well. Now, tonight, we'll present to you statements in numerous publications from the 18th and 19th centuries that locate the battle near Heathfield and which appear to have been overlooked by modern historians. We will follow this with discussion of a possible location for the Hoar Apple Tree at a medieval place bearing that name, and a long-standing tradition of a Saxon-era battle on the very ground that concerns us. Rebecca will present this material, and I will then analyse the military and topographical considerations to show how the Heathfield area could have fitted into the fateful 1066 campaign. We want to make clear at the outset that we are not saying that the battle could only have taken place at the location we are suggesting. Our aim here is to present the evidence that we have found and suggest how the rival armies could have met here on the 14th of October 1066. We want you to make up your own minds. Have we really found compelling evidence for the true site of the battle? Or can it all be explained away as a series of strange coincidences? I'll now hand over to Rebecca, who will present textual evidence for the battlefield being in the vicinity of Heathfield.
Good evening. I'm now going to present examples from a cluster of publications that name the battlefield of Hastings Heathfield or Heathfield Down, and some which place the battle in the actual parish of Heathfield itself. In the 18th century, the printing of detailed maps, alongside growing interest in travel and the study of antiquities, meant that information was being shared in new ways. Antiquarians made use of manuscript collections held in private libraries, and travel writers were some of the first to record local stories and traditions which may not otherwise have survived. New publications for the time included national histories, travel logs, and gazetteers. And these brought together interesting facts, sites, and histories about places and localities in Britain. The Battle of Hastings regularly featured in such publications. The site of Battle Abbey and its foundation story was an obvious piece of national history that readers would have been familiar with. Perhaps more surprising, however, is that some of these texts name Heathfield, the parish or the place, to have been the site of the battle. Some French texts even go so far as naming it the Battle of Heathfield. The only Heathfield in Sussex at that time was the village known today as Old Heathfield, with the modern town developing after 1880 and the arrival of the railway. So the association between Heathfield and the battle occurs over a very long period of time, from 1706, the earliest we have found so far, to the early 20th century. The bishop and antiquarian White Kennet published a complete history of England in 1706, in which he writes, "The battle was fought near Heathfield in Sussex, at the place where now stands the town of Battle." In 1732, the French historian Aubry de la Mottray identified Heathfield as a name of the battlefield itself. And he wrote, "They generally called that the Battle of Hastings, fought upon a plain called Heathfield." A similar statement was made about the plain of Heathfield by the novelist and journalist Daniel Defoe in 1742, and that was in his book Tour. Meanwhile, on the continent, the French historian Paul de Rapin began writing a history of England. His editor, Nicholas Tyndall, a Hampshire rector, adds that the battle was fought near Heathfield in Sussex, in the place where the town of Battle now stands. And this perhaps suggests that he was in possession of a fresh piece of information. At this time, some important developments concerning the interpretation of the Battle of Hastings were taking place in France. The antiquary and monk Bernard de Montfaucon, a founder of modern archaeology, had just seen the very first drawings made of the tapestry at a meeting in Paris. With the help of Benedictine monks in Normandy, Montfaucon tracked down the artwork and brought it back into public circulation. The 1750 English edition of his major work, a collection of regal and ecclesiastical antiquities with 300 copperplate engravings, refers to the Battle of Hastings as the Battle of Heathfield, no fewer than 4 times. Plate 56, showing the tapestry, is described as a representation of the historical circumstances relating to Harold, to his death in the famous Battle of Heathfield in Sussex. To be deemed a worthy addition to the work of the leading scholar of antiquities, the Heathfield name for the battle was clearly more than just a local rumour or eccentric mistake. Moreover, the name of Hastings for the battle is also absent from the publication, meaning that the editor deemed it appropriate to use Heathfield as the common name. In 1751, in England's Gazetteer, Stephen Whatley made a more detailed statement connecting Heathfield with the Battle of Hastings. And he wrote that Heathfield lies on a down of its own name, near Burwash Downs. On this plain was fought the decisive battle between William the Conqueror and King Harold. This seems to be the earliest source to state that the battle took place on the high ground immediately above Old Heathfield, on ground then known as Heathfield Down. Several further instances of apparent confusion between a place called Heathfield and the traditional location of Battle Abbey are found in other 18th century texts, suggesting that the two names or places had become inextricably linked. For example, in A History of Sieges and Battles, 1762, and John Wesley's A Concise History of England, 1776, they locate the battle near Heathfield in Sussex, in the place where now stands the town of Battle. And in 1778, the German geographer and historian Anton Büching stated that the fight between Harold and William, Duke of Normandy, nearby on the plain of Heathfield, gave the battle its name. Although Büching was writing about the town of Battle, his statement infers that Heathfield was the name of the battle itself. The confusion between the name Heathfield and the Abbey battlefield tradition was by this time widespread and deep-rooted. Various gazetteers and dictionaries made by compilers such as Andrew Bryce, Philip Luckham, and Benjamin Pitts Capper continue with the idea of the battlefield being called Heathfield or located near Old Heathfield. Importantly, Capper names Heathfield Down as the actual site, writing the example here. On the down here was fought the Battle of Hastings, which gave the English crown to William the Conqueror. In 1787, Heathfield became the name of a barony bestowed upon General George Augustus Eliot, and he owned the Heathfield Park estate. And this barony was given for his command of the garrison at the Great Siege of Gibraltar during the American War of Independence. Between 1787 and 1803, a number of texts referred to the Heathfield Park estate, which encompassed many surrounding farms. And they described this as the actual spot where the Battle of Hastings was fought. Philip de la Motte wrote in 1803 that the site of their barony is a plain within a few miles of Hastings, where the decisive battle for the crown of England was fought. Samuel Pegg, in Curialia Miscellanea, 1818, wrote, Sir George Augustus Eliot chose this place, Heathfield Park, in Sussex, for his title. It is said that the decisive battle called the Battle of Hastings was fought on this spot. Pegg does not mention Battle Abbey or the battle being fought there. Moreover, the words "it is said" seem to suggest a well-known tradition. It is intriguing to note that Baron Heathfield claimed descent from William de Aliot, a close companion of William the Conqueror in 1066, and part of the heraldic arms of the Eliot family were those given by William I to William de Aliot. And while many British landed families of that era could claim a Norman heritage, the legend raises the possibility that this could be the reason why Baron Heathfield, who was of a Scottish branch of the family, chose Heathfield Park as his seat. So moving into the 19th century, a new Universal Gazetteer, 1821, records that the battle was fought only in the neighbourhood of Hastings, while the entry for Battle Town does not mention the conflict at all, or the Abbey. Under Heathfield Parish is written, on the down here was fought the celebrated Battle of Hastings. The authors, Jedediah Morse and his son, leaders in their fields of geography and telegraphy, state that their information came from the Edinburgh Gazetteer, which was based on newly gathered geographical materials. So even though these newly published gazetteers had been thoroughly reassessed and refreshed, they still give Heathfield Down as the place where the battle was fought. Additionally, the London General Gazetteer, 1825, and the Treasury of Knowledge, 1836, give the actual parish of Heathfield as the site of the battle. None of them state that Battle Town or its abbey were the battlefield site. In 1866, Heathfield Down, as the name of the battlefield, appears in Charles Kingsley's historical novel Hereward the Wake, Last of the English, and again in a lecture given by Kingsley in 1874. So, in light of the fact that the settlement of Heathfield grew up in the 12th century, several decades after the Battle of Hastings, our suggested explanation for the Heathfield association is that the battle was fought on the adjacent down, later known as Heathfield Down, and that over time the battlefield became known by the name of the closest settlement to it. Knowledge of the battlefield survived in folk memory, independently of the Battle Abbey tradition, until it reached the 18th century writers. What often resulted was a fusion of the two traditions, where authors and editors assumed that a piece of land close to the Abbey was formerly known as Heathfield Down, Heathfield Plain, or simply Heathfield. This would have been a logical assumption to make if they were unfamiliar with this area of the country. Yet no evidence of a Heathfield in the vicinity of Battle Abbey has been found to support this assumption. So those were just a few of the examples that we discussed in our published article, and there remain more to be written up. However, the survival of the Battle of Heathfield tradition in so many texts is not the only link between the place and the memory of a great battle. A strong local tradition of an Anglo-Saxon battle is associated with an area of land, once part of Heathfield Down, and formerly known as Slaughter Common. And as you can see on the slide here, Slaughter Common is designated by that large oval shape. So the common covered a very large area west of Punnet's town and close to Cade Street, extending south of Chapel Cross to Aylesbury, which is just there. Several historians, including Mark Lower, John Coleman, and E.V. Lucas, allude to Slaughter Common as the scene of a severe battle, a tradition that was preserved amongst the Heathfield people. And even now, descendants of old families in the Heathfield area continue to remember Slaughter Common as the site of a battle. And in local knowledge, field names still speak of a historic conflict, a field within our focus area being known as the battlefield. In 1848, Slaughter Common was the site of an archaeological discovery when a bronze battle axe was found there. At a meeting of the Society of Antiquaries, it was noted that although not a Battle of Hastings find, the axe nevertheless lay, and I quote, within the area of that locality which in 1066 formed the memorable field of Hastings. From the place where it was found, the antiquaries said, the impression might naturally be expected to arise that it was a relic of that great event, thus suggesting that the Society of Antiquaries was fully acquainted with the Heathfield tradition. The axe, which bore a dragon motif, was exhibited by Robert Porrett, Fellow of the Society, and afterwards transferred to the armouries at the Tower of London. So I'm moving on now to discuss the possible site of the Hoar Apple Tree, which Simon mentioned in the introduction. The 11th century Norman and French accounts of the battle do not provide a precise location for the conflict, nor the name of any settlement or topographical feature in its vicinity. Domesday records only one settlement in the area, which was Warbleton. However, the passage from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Simon mentioned earlier, shown here, provides a name for the battlefield that was known on the English side. And this was the Grey or Hoar Apple Tree, Harran Appledren. In Anglo-Saxon land charters, Har or Hoar apple trees often marked out estate boundaries. The Har element often meant boundary, although some scholars suggest that Hoar could also refer to the greyness or hoariness associated with age, the presence of tendril-like lichen, or even a sense of liminality. In 1869, the historian Edward Freeman described the Hoar Apple Tree as a relic of former times. Michael Bintley concludes that the tree was a gathering point for the English army because it was one with which they were all familiar. Bintley is also convinced of the authenticity of the Harran Appledren, and he writes that the only reference to this tree is to be found in the only Anglo-Saxon account of the battle, and that no mention of it is made in the Norman sources, suggests that the detail is genuine. It is hard to think of any other good reason for its inclusion. So while generations of scholars have assumed that any modern-day connection with such a tree must be long gone and no longer traceable, we have adopted a different approach. For such a tree to be a muster point and halting place for the English army, it would surely have had local and regional significance as a landmark and place. The name of the place should then have survived in some form long after the event. The mention of the tree in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle could thus be a valuable clue in the search for the battlefield. In Anglo-Saxon England, veteran trees situated on common land sometimes functioned as civil or religious meeting places. However, it would seem unlikely that a mere local boundary or marker tree could have become known to the writer of a national chronicle, as the name of the battlefield, unless it was known over a larger geographical area. From the information provided by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D text, we can infer that Harold and his army must have been stationed at or in the vicinity of the Hoar Apple Tree. Having arrived in East Sussex after a rapid march from London, military logic would point to his likely use of a prearranged halting place on or near to an ancient boundary. The military historian Jim Bradbury also argued that such a meeting place was a necessity, and that the Hoar Apple Tree, wherever it was, must have been that prearranged assembly point. As suggested by the Anglo-Saxon military specialists John Baker and Stuart Brooks, for places of military assembly to be easily accessible from more than one district, they would have been close to important routes and clearly marked on the ground by a natural or man-made feature. Being distinctively marked in the landscape, and I quote, "These locations were well enough known that they could be used by troops travelling from more than 80 kilometres away." The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that in 878 AD, Alfred the Great gathered an army at Egbert's Stone in Wiltshire before the Battle of Hastings, and he camped overnight at Eilioke, which stood on a 100 boundary at the edge of Selwood Forest. The Hoar Apple Tree of 1066 was likely then to have been a prominent landmark and an ancient landscape feature, making it an attractive place for an army facing an enormous challenge ahead to halt, rest, and prepare. There is compelling evidence that such a veteran tree did indeed survive for centuries up on the downs of Heathfield. A place named Hoar Apple Tree is recorded in the English Place Name Survey as an early medieval site, which stood on the boundary between the rapes of Hastings and Pevensey. The rapes being early territorial subdivisions of Sussex. You can see on the slide, this is the boundary to which I refer here, running north to south. Hoar Apple Tree features in several deeds, including a 13th century gift of land in Heathfield parish, which is described as lying on the northern side of the King's Highway, leading from Burwash, which is up here, to Hoar Apple Tree. Yeah. And Hoar Apple Tree, the place name itself, was derived from the Anglo-Saxon Haran Appledran, the ancient name given to us in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D text. In 1926, writing in Sussex Notes and Queries, a local historian, David MacLeod, identified the lost Hoar Apple Tree Common as having been on Heathfield Down. He noted that Hoar Apple Tree was the medieval name for that area, and that North Down, north of modern Heathfield, visible on the map there, was the last remaining trace of that common. In 1928, MacLeod returned to the subject, this time in Sussex Archaeological Collections, where he wrote, "It seems probable that the common was called the Hoar or Boundary Apple Common because upon it stood the ancient rape boundary mark, at one time a tree." Referring to a monument known as the Old Rape Stone, which stood just within Heathfield Down and marking the boundary between the rapes of Hastings and Pevensey, MacLeod suggests that this stone replaced the earlier Hoar or Boundary Apple Tree. The division of the southeastern counties into rapes or lathes likely had Saxon origins, meaning that the old rape stone would have been a well-defined boundary in 1066. Mark Lower had noted in 1897 that an ancient tree was likely still marking the spot during the reign of Edward III, again suggesting an ancient landscape feature that predated the Norman conquest. And as late as the 1930s, people still recorded seeing the old rapestone standing there on the remaining area of common. And as there was no other Hoar Apple Tree or similar place name in East Sussex, it seems probable that the survival of this Hoar Apple Tree on Heathfield Down was due to its significance as a boundary marker over a very long period of time. We imagine the Hoar Apple Tree to have been distinctively marked in the landscape, possibly something like the tree pictured here. I have before suggested elsewhere that it was more likely to have been a veteran oak or beech than an apple tree, for the primary reason that apple trees only live to 75 years on average, and they make a less compelling landmark. And if we turn now to the final scene of the Bayard Tapestry, we can see a lone tree on an area of hilly ground, past which the retreating English flee. The detail of the nuts or acorns clearly suggests a pollard, beech, or oak, rather than an apple tree. In the absence of settlements in the area, the scribe of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle must have deemed such a tree to be an appropriate symbol or place to give its name to the battlefield. I'm now going to hand over to Simon, who will discuss the military and topographical questions. Thanks.
Okay, yes, I'll look at some military and topographical considerations. Now, we know that the battle took place somewhere within a well-defined geographical region, the ancient territory of the Hastings, contained within the tidal bays of Pevensey and Romney, and the Andrides Weald, the once great forest which in early medieval times stretched from Hampshire to Kent. Now, the downs around Heathfield are the highest points in this district, ideal for observation and in sight of the coast. The specific location that we suggest was the position of Harold's army is the ridge aligned southwest to northeast, lying between the villages of Cade Street and Punnett Town. Yes, the position of Harold's army we are suggesting is this triangular piece of high ground here. All the dark grey is Heathfield Down. If Harold had occupied this ridge, he would have faced a Norman attack from the southeasterly and southerly directions. This ridge is within the area marked Heathfield Down on late 18th century and 19th century maps. The ridge is narrow, with a steep valley of the River Dudwell protecting the rear and left flank of the position. Hopefully you can just see this blue line here. That's the River Dudwell, some tributaries and some steep ravines all along here. The shape of the ridge would have allowed the army to adopt a wedge-shaped formation, with the right flank probably extending to a point close to the Jack Cade Memorial. It's the edge of Cade Street over here, where it might have been protected by woods or a forest ditch. The modern road through Cade Street, which follows an ancient ridgeway, is on a narrow connecting ridge, and the position we are suggesting for Harold's army completely controls the entry to this pinch point. The road continues along here through Cade Street. That is a very narrow pinch point. So Harold's army, we're saying, would have controlled this, the access to that pinch point. Now we return to this graphic. This was a position that an invading army, intending to reach the important routes towards London, which we discuss later, could not have bypassed. And we've just drawn in the projected position of Harold's army there. And yes, all the pink is Heathfield Down, high ground. Now, the name Heathfield, first recorded in the 12th century, is a pre-conquest topographical name, likely to indicate cleared, uncultivated land. In Sussex, these fields or felds were once Saxon swine pastures, which receded as the Weald forest was cut and cleared. According to Margaret Gelling, Heathfield belongs to a category of felds in which the first element, heath, specifically concerns the type of surface. A probable early source of the battle, though its date is disputed, the Carmen de Hastings Broglio, or the Song of the Battle of Hastings, describes the emergence of the English army as seen by the Normans onto the ground that would become the battlefield. And here's the quote from it. "From the hiding places of the woods, a host dashed forward. There was a hill near the forest and a neighboring valley, and the ground was untilled because of its roughness." Similarly, William of Poitiers, the most detailed early source for the battle, states that Harold's army, I quote, took their stand on higher ground, on a hill near to the wood through which they had come. The proximity of woodland is also depicted in the Bayeux tapestry. There we see some rather stylized trees here, and there are further trees actually within the battle scenes and at the very end where we see the retreat. Thus, the English position was likely to have been in a cleared area of uncultivated land at the southern edge of the Andrides Weald forest, the type of rough, stony, common land of the High Weald district, typified by the Heathfield area. Combined with a significant upward slope, this was just the type of terrain that Harold needed to counter the threat of the Norman cavalry. Right, this is the last time you'll be seeing this particular slide. And we'll just look at this possible strategic significance of the Heathfield Down area. Now, Heathfield Down was a large area of ground that extended from at least as far as Little Tottingworth, that's up here, eastwards to Watkins Down near Punnet's Down. There's Watkins Down there, and the village of Punnet's Down there. The village of Cade Street is there, we talked about earlier. The down extended north of a main high road running east to west, known as the King's Highway, which passed just to the north of Heathfield. That's the King's Highway running through there. We suggest that Harold, having marched from London to East Sussex, would have needed a place to halt his army, to gather intelligence, assess his options, and very probably await additional forces. This place would need to be accessible via key routes to potential reinforcements marching from different directions. Logic dictates that an army which had yet to complete its mobilization should not assemble too close to the enemy. By halting at Heathfield Down, some 12 to 16 miles from the Norman-controlled area, Harold could have reasonably believed that he was outside the range of enemy scouts. The Normans' base is usually assumed to have been at Hastings, although doubts have been raised about its location. Colonel Charles Lemon, who believed Caldbeck Hill, a mile north of the traditional battlefield, to have been the assembly point for the English army, suggests that Harold committed, and I quote, "the strategic blunder of attempting to concentrate his forces within striking distance of the enemy. We agree that this would have been a serious mistake and take the view that an experienced commander, which Harold was, would have been unlikely to have made it. By selecting an assembly point at a greater distance from his enemy, but still controlling key routes, Harold's strategic options and his chances of maximizing the mobilization of his forces would have been considerably increased." Now, we're going to look at possible routes that Harold could have taken from London, because he spent a few days in London after returning from the north and his battle at Stamford Bridge. Now, historians who assume that Battle Abbey to have been the battlefield often suggest that Harold marched from London along the Roman road from Rochester to Bodiam, crossing the River Rother before heading further south to Caldbeck Hill and Battle. This Roman road is here, the dark blue line going all the way through Bodiam and on to Battle. However, no documentary evidence has been found to support this. And there were two other options open to Harold, both of which would have brought him to Heathfield Down. He could have marched down the London to Lewes Road, that's this green one on the left, turning off onto the Uckfield to Rye Ridgeway. That's the one that runs southeast through Heathfield Down and all the way to the coast. Or he could have taken a more direct ridgeway from London south through Tunbridge, which is situated on the River Medway. That's this orange one here, also going on to Heathfield Down. The Victorian historian Edward Freeman suggested that Harold marched via Tunbridge, and two local traditions exist which give support to this possibility. The first is a long family tradition of Harold's army passing through the grounds of Riverhill House in the parish of Lee near Tunbridge. That's Riverhill House, that's Tunbridge, by a track known as Harold's Road, which was marked on medieval maps. The second tradition relates to a field in Bidborough, just south of Tunbridge, called Camp Field, where it is said that Harold's army stayed on the night of the 12th of October. That's Bidborough just here, just southwest of Tunbridge. Ivan Margery, in his book, Roman Ways in the Weald, identified various Roman routes through the Weald, including one that led through Tunbridge and on to Cross in Hand, close to modern Heathfield. Notably, in later medieval times, troops bound for the Crusades to the Holy Land are said to have assembled at Cross in Hand before heading to the coast. The strategic importance of Tunbridge on a crossing of the River Medway was recognised by the Normans' construction of a castle there soon after the conquest. A medieval history, the Brute Chronicle, alludes to the Battle of Hastings ending at Tunbridge, an interesting claim in light of Tunbridge's strategic position at the head of a series of defensive structures leading to the coast. Some important ancient routes crossed Heathfield Down. The aforementioned Uckfield to Rye Ridgeway, there, which connected the Roman road from London to Lewes with the East Sussex coast, was a prehistoric or Roman trackway. As the modern B2096, this ridgeway passes through Cade Street and nearby hilltop villages to the southeast, and a branch runs through Battle to Fairlight near Hastings. This would have been the natural link between the northern High Weald and the coast. Another ridgeway, which I mentioned earlier, known as the King's Highway, was of probable prehistoric or possibly Roman date, and runs along the modern A265 just north of Heathfield. That's along here. It intersects with the Uckfield to Fairlight Ridgeway and connects the Heathfield Down area to the upper Rother Valley to the east. So that connects Heathfield area to this area, the upper Rother Valley. This junction of the two ridgeways lay at the edge of the later Hoar Apple Tree Common and about 1 mile from Slaughter Common. Now, I'm just going to talk a bit about how the armies could have met near Heathfield. As previously stated, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D-text describes the Normans taking Harold unawares. The E version of the Chronicle reports that Harold was forced to fight before all his troops had arrived, and the 12th century historian John of Worcester, who was probably using English sources now lost to us, claims that only half of the English army was drawn up when the battle commenced. Thus, these three English sources strongly suggest that Harold was not fully prepared for battle, either due to some problem with troop mobilization, or to being taken by surprise, or possibly a combination of both. We suggest that these accounts, while admittedly brief, suggest a credible scenario, and we question the popular theory that Harold had always intended to occupy a defensive position on the ridge at Battle Abbey. If the Hoar Apple Tree was the rendezvous or final mobilization place, then that could well explain why the battle was fought there or nearby. Harold could have been awaiting additional forces when the Normans appeared unexpectedly, thus forcing him to fight. The military historians Jim Bradbury and Colonel Lemon also believe that the vicinity of the tree became the battlefield for this reason. The sighting of Harold's army by Norman scouts in William of Poitiers' account suggests that advanced scouts played a key role in the build-up to the battle. We thus consider it likely that on the 13th of October, advanced Norman scouts spotted Harold's army in the vicinity of Heathfield Down. The Normans then made a rapid early morning march on the 14th of October, and the sources indicate that the battle began from the beginning of the 3rd hour, that is around 9 a.m. Returning to the critical passage in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D text, stating that Harold was taken unawares, we suggest that the Normans achieved a measure of surprise through the speed of their march and the likelihood that Harold thought he was out of range of a sudden march. We also think it very likely that the Normans would have needed an advanced camp for the night of the 13th of October in order to reduce the marching distance the next morning to no more than 7 miles. A related issue which we can't explore tonight is the question of the site of the Normans' fortified base before the battle. This place is named Hestinga Siesta on the Bayer Tapestry. There we see the text up there, Hestinga Siesta, and they're actually working on an additional earthwork within this place. Most historians assume this to have been a 9th century Saxon burh located at Hastings. However, recent research has identified Pevensey with its Roman fort as the more probable site of this burh. And just to remind you again of the geography, Pevensey over here and Hastings there. Pevensey is thus a strong candidate for the location of the Normans' base in 1066. Now, just to say a few things in conclusion, the various documentary evidence we have presented tonight points to the strong possibility of the battlefield of Hastings being located within the area once known as Heathfield Down, close to modern Heathfield. The 18th and 19th century texts from which Rebecca quoted show that a strong tradition connecting the battle with Heathfield survived into this era of antiquarianism. Looking afresh at the name Hoar Apple Tree or Hoar Apple Tree, the only name for the battlefield given in the early sources, we highlighted a relevant medieval place name, Hoar Apple Tree, located on Heathfield Down. Additionally, we noted the survival of a long-standing tradition of a Saxon-era battle associated with the land we propose as the battlefield. As the Battle of Hastings was one of the most pivotal single events in British history, we feel that every effort should be made to find its location and hope that our work will bring a fresh perspective to the debate. A reconsideration of the location question would naturally lead to a reassessment of other related issues, such as the site of the Normans' base prior to the battle. While more research remains to be done, we hope that our theory will lead to an archaeological investigation of the proposed battlefield, and we are at present actively looking at ways to begin this. We are grateful for the opportunity to present our work to you this evening, and thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you both for a very clear exposition, putting forward what I'm aware is a sort of controversial idea. I'll open it up to questions in a moment. I wonder whether I can just kick off with a sort of general question. The textual evidence for Heathfield that you presented is essentially antiquarian from the 18th century onward. Have you got anything that takes us back before that sort of burgeoning of antiquarian interest in the 18th century that can sort of help with those, what you're arguing is an oral tradition coming through?
That we are looking into possible mentions of these traditions going back as far as we possibly can. Of course, the difficulty arises that much was written in Latin, so it becomes a stumbling block for us. But we have looked into Dugdale, who makes mention of the founding of Battle Abbey tradition, and also looked at John Speed, 1611. They don't actually mention Heathfield Down or the Heathfield tradition clearly. There seemed to be some confusion with the Northern Battle of Heathfield, which was translated, it was written in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that was translated in the mid-17th century. So I think that might be where the confusion arises between the two battles of Heathfield. So, but there remains much more work to be done, I think, in that.
So just very quickly, yes, well, we think it is possible that the appearance of Heathfield connection in the 18th century could have been the actual antiquarians discovering oral tradition, perhaps local tradition, which had survived. And so it hadn't been through the lens of the Norman chroniclers.
Yep.
And so that is one possibility we're looking at, but we can't find the origin so far of the Heathfield name, but we're still looking.
So I have the microphone. Thanks for that. It's very interesting to hear a new theory. I think I know where the origin of the Heathfield thing is. So you mentioned the Complete History of England by White Kennet. That's the name associated with the work, but the notes in the first volume are by John Strype, who's a scholar clergyman, and he's notoriously inaccurate. And he actually confused the Battle of Hastings with the Battle of Heathfield or Heavenfield, 14633 to 634. Now, his note, which you cited, was replicated word for word by Nicholas Tyndall in the English edition of Rapin, and then it found its way into the third edition of de la Mottray, either through Mottray or his editor, who confused Heathfield and Battle. And that's how this sort of error about Heathfield was generated in the literature. But leaving that aside, my question really is, the site of the Battle Abbey, it's a dry, narrow sandstone ridge. There's no water there. It's a very inappropriate place to have a monastery. There's little landscape there that wasn't terraced later to accommodate the monastic buildings. William could have founded the abbey a little bit higher up, where the plateau broadens out, or a little bit lower down next to an actual water source, but he chose that particular spot. And of course, in the annal for the Chronicle, which you didn't mention, written in the 1080s originally, which then got its way into the Peterborough Chronicle, we're told that he founded the abbey there because that's where the battle was fought. So my question is, why didn't he found the abbey a little bit further up the ridge or a little bit lower down, but on that particular spot? Thanks.
Well, I think all the land around that area, in fact, all of the high-wheeled landscape would have been extremely difficult for building an abbey. I mean, at this distance of time is very difficult to say why. I mean, Battle Abbey, the ridge in which it's founded, is actually considerably lower than the hills around, and also closer to the coast. It may have been logistically more helpful getting materials in. There may have been other reasons, more sort of aesthetic reasons, because it does look very attractive and where it is sited, and you can see it from the three higher hills around it, Telham Hill and Netherfield Hill, etc., and Caldbeck Hill. I think the siting of an abbey was quite a complex issue, and the abbey was actually moved, as we know from the Battle Abbey, the original site where they started building. For some reason, it was moved from there, as the Battle Abbey Chronicle records. And then they say, well, it was moved because William insisted that the battle should be founded on the battlefield, but they had to provide some explanation for the movement. And obviously we can talk about the Battle Abbey Chronicle being a rather unreliable source, but I would just say to you, yes, it is a complex question, the siting of an abbey, and there are many factors that perhaps we don't know about.
Can I just say, when people online can't hear if you speak without the mic, so if I can ask people to confine comments when they've got the mic, thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I thought it was a very interesting sort of historiographical survey on how an idea can take root and get repeated. And for that, it's very valuable indeed. So thank you. The thing I'd like to ask you is about the excavations that you mentioned. You say that there's been several excavations at Battle Abbey which have failed to find anything. Well, other than the Time Team excavation, which basically was a weekend looking at about 1% of the land in an area that had already been sort of built over, and Hare's 1980 excavation, which was basically looking at the Abbey itself, and indeed didn't find anything ferrous related to the Abbey. What are these excavations that you mentioned that failed to find anything at the battlefield?
Right, well, certainly the one in the 1980s, I remember. Yes, you're quite right, the Time Team was very sketchy. I can't recall when the others were, but since the Time Team program, excavation was carried out on the land just to the east of the Abbey. I think that was in 2014. This is where they're now saying that the battle could have been fought because of the doubts Time Team found regarding the very waterlogged ground. So they didn't find anything in 2014. So that's the other one, I would say, that has not succeeded so far.
We've had a question from our online audience asking, do you have any thoughts about nearby Horham, which is a well-known apple growing area?
We know of the place. Certainly, we've seen it on a map. We haven't had any reason so far to look into it, but certainly, yes, that's something we might explore.
Further questions or comments from our audience?
Thank you very much. Just wondering about that name Slaughter Down. I mean, how far back does that name go? Is that symbolic, do you think?
Slaughter Common seems to first appear in the 18th and 19th centuries, so it's a relatively recent name. But we do wonder whether it could be a corruption of a former name that's taken that turn in light of the conflict that took place, as has happened in Haslington at Slaughter Hill in Cheshire, for an English Civil War battlefield in, I think it was 1642.
Thank you. I'm sorry to come in on the example of Haslington and to bore everybody with details, but I did read your article very carefully. That solitary instance of a slaughter place name supposedly associated with the battlefield at Haslington, and you mentioned the Civil War skirmish there in 1642. If you go to the English Place Name Society volume for Cheshire, you'll find that the place name Slaughter Hill is attested in the 1530s and the 1580s, so it predates the battle that became associated with it later. And looking through the English Place Name Society website, there's not a single example of a slaughter place name connected with a battle. In fact, the word slaughter came into the English language to refer to large numbers of people being killed for the first time. It's on record in 1338, which is it's quite late, and it's a long time after most of these landscape place names are established. So I think it's probably a red herring, but over to you.
Thank you for that. What we would say is the most significant aspect of this area slaughter common is the very long-standing tradition of a battle from the Saxon era. And that's mentioned by E.V. Lucas in about 1909, Highways and Byways in Sussex. And he was well aware at that time that it was a very long tradition. There is a field still known, or within living memory has been known as the battlefield. Local people told us about this. So we would point to that rather than the name slaughter common. So yes, that's our answer to that.
The Haslington example is thought to be originally Slow Tree Hill as well. So there is a case for possibly the name evolving over time in light of the events that took place there.
Any further questions or comments?
Sorry to come in again. It's just about that slaughter, okay? Are you aware of any other places in Sussex that have that name? Because if there are others, it would perhaps suggest that it's not connected with the battle. I've had a look and I found 6 throughout the county, and that's just what I found, and that's only in Sussex. So would you say that does actually suggest that, as has been said before, that actually it doesn't really have anything to do with the...
I'm not sure I'd entirely agree, because Slotra, coming from the Saxon muddy place, could be applied to a much older place name, but in this case we're looking at a modern name with a very old battle tradition attached to it that goes beyond. So we're looking much further back in history at a tradition that survived locally. So the place name is almost secondary to the tradition itself.
Is that what you said about the battle in Cheshire?
Well, I was saying that there's no conclusive evidence whether which came first. Yeah.
If there are no further... Yep.
So just on the military side of things, William of Jumièges, writing the official history of William the Conqueror in the late 1060s, 1069, says that William marched out of his camp, which he places at Hastings. I mean, Pevensey, it doesn't really matter, Hastings or Pevensey, at dawn, and the armies met 3 hours later. So the consensus on medieval march rates is that they're 2.5 or 3 miles per hour, whether it's cavalry or foot together. And we've got to allow time for the armies to draw up for battle. So that means that at the maximum rate of 3 miles an hour, allowing no time for the armies to draw up for battle, William could get about 9 miles. Heathfield is 17 or 18 miles north of Hastings. It's a little bit less from Pevensey. But it seems that it's a long way out of the possible march rates that could have been covered in that period. So my question to you is William of Jumièges wrong, like all the other early writers who you kind of put to one side, or do we need to kind of find another way around that? Thanks.
Okay, well, there's actually a fair bit of confusion in those early sources about what happened in the hours before the battle, or even the day before the battle. William of Poitiers is very confused. He seems to indicate at one point that, well, the scouts were sent out, spotted Howe's army. That would indicate the battle took place the next day, but he seems to suggest that the battle took place very soon after that, the same day as the scouts made their sighting. And some of William's troops were out foraging. William of Jumièges talks about Harold planning a night attack. And so does William of Poitiers, but how on earth did they know that? Now, as for the logistics, which you rightly refer to, we would say certainly that William's army would have needed to cut down the marching distance in those 3 hours in the early morning to around about 6 or 7 miles. They could have done that very easily by moving to an advanced camp, a military, well, a strategy that's seen for other battles in the Anglo-Saxon era. For example, Alfred's Battle of Heathfield Down in 878, and also the Northern Battle of of Heathfield, which somebody mentioned earlier, also an early morning surprise attack or a rapid advance. So our position is that we think, in the absence of any clear information about what the sources are saying in those hours before the battle, we think an advanced camp would have been logical. And if they didn't mention it, the sources didn't mention it, perhaps they didn't fully understand that that's actually what happened, and maybe it didn't add anything to the narrative. And also the Coleman de Hastings broglio, also a rather confused account of the pre-battle preparations and movements.
If there are no more questions or comments, can we thank our speakers for presenting the ideas. I give notice that the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 6th of March. Will be our out of London Welsh meeting to be held in Cardiff, where we will hear a paper, Excavations at Llanbedroch, the development of an early medieval trading centre in Viking Age Wales, by Dr. Mark Ridnap, Fellow. Meeting stands adjourned. There's a drink outside. I hope you'll join us.